this final chapter of Florida's most chilling true crime stories, we uncover the last and most disturbing cases of female killers who shocked the nation. Cold, calculated, and unforgettable, these women left a dark mark on history. This is Part 3, the final episode of Florida's Female Killers. 38. Elaine Antoinette Parent. She was born in the Bronx, 1942. Intelligent, charismatic, and unnervingly adaptable, she would come to be known as the Chameleon Killer, not for how many lives she took, but for how many lives she lived. In July of 1990, Beverly McGowan, a 34-year-old Florida bank clerk, placed a classified ad looking for a roommate. She mentioned 2 cats and a modest rent. A woman named Alice responded. She claimed to be British, working for IBM, and had a fascination with numerology. Beverly welcomed her in. Within days, Beverly vanished. Friends received typed letters claiming she had quit her job, sold her home, and was planning to travel. The story unraveled when her body was discovered in a remote canal just one day after her disappearance. Though attempts were made to conceal her identity, one small ankle tattoo told investigators what they needed to know. Police quickly realized Alice wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Elaine Parent. By then, she was already gone, having used Beverly's credit cards to buy a plane ticket, disappearing overseas under yet another stolen identity. What followed was a 12-year global manhunt. Parent was more than a fugitive. She was a shapeshifter. Investigators uncovered over 20 aliases used across multiple countries. She stole identities with precision from roommates, from women she seduced, even from headstones in cemeteries. She posed as a psychic, a linguist, a real estate agent. Sometimes she spoke with a refined English accent. Other times she claimed South African roots. She once mailed police a photograph of an oil painting of herself, signing it, "Best wishes, your chameleon." It wasn't a taunt. It was a signature. Each clue led to another dead end. At one point, she was living in London with a former lover. At another, she was running a restaurant in New Mexico. She even filed a civil lawsuit in Florida and won while police were still searching for her. Over the years, sightings came in from Paris, Sydney, Istanbul, but she always slipped away. Finally, in April 2002, a tip led authorities to a quiet apartment in Panama City, Florida. They knocked on the door. She asked for a moment to get dressed. Moments later, a single shot rang out from the bedroom. Elaine Parent had taken her own life. No trial, no answers. Only fragments of a life built on deception, and one confirmed victim, Beverly McGowan. Some investigators still believe there may have been others. But with Parent's death, the secrets went with her. Forensic psychologist Dr. Barbara Kerwin once described her as driven by psychological demons, stealing identities to fill up the emptiness of her own personality. She didn't just become other people. She erased herself, and in doing so became legend. 39. Linda PEDROZA. She was 17. A quiet teen to some, rebellious to others. But in the summer of 2000, Linda PEDROZA made a choice that would define the rest of her life and end another. Born in 1983, Linda lived in Palm Beach County, Florida. Her home life was far from ideal. A turbulent relationship with her parents, a father in and out of jail, and a mother described as strict and overwhelmed. But by June of that year, Linda had something else, a relationship with a man 6 years older, Antoine Wright. Her mother, Isabel PEDROZA, disapproved of the relationship. After reportedly catching the two in a compromising situation, tensions escalated. Isabel wanted the relationship to end. Linda didn't. And that's when everything changed. On June 23, 2000, Isabel returned home from work. According to later confessions, Wright struck her and then together he and Linda ended her life using an electrical cord. Their motive to remove the one person standing in the way of their future. But the crime didn't end there. In a failed attempt to destroy evidence, the couple placed Isabel's body in a bathtub and poured acid over it, a method Linda claimed was inspired by a family story her mother had once told her. When that didn't work, they wrapped the body and left it in a wooded area known as the acreage. Days later, Linda reported her mother missing. She told authorities Isabel had left after a fight, possibly to Texas. Neighbors recalled Linda acting normally, smiling, hosting gatherings, even living in the house as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't long before the truth began to unravel. On July 4th, surveyors discovered a body in the woods. Jewelry and dental records confirmed it was Isabel PEDROZA. By mid-July, Linda and Wright were arrested. Both confessed. Both were charged with first-degree murder and grand theft. At just 17 years old, Linda faced the possibility of life in prison or worse. 2 years later, facing damning testimony from her now ex-boyfriend, Linda pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The court sentenced her to 40 years. With good behavior, her earliest possible release will be when she's 51. Wright, in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors, received a 20-year sentence. His statement painted Linda as the instigator, the one who made the call that it was time. Prosecutors agreed. Some saw Linda as a troubled teen manipulated by an older man. Others saw her as the mastermind. But either way, what led to her mother's death was a devastating cocktail of desperation, dysfunction, and a misguided idea of love. In a tearful court appearance, Linda admitted her guilt with a single word: yes. The story of Linda PEDROZA isn't just about a crime. It's about a family unraveling choices made in the heat of emotion and the haunting consequences of crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. 40. Martha PINEDA. In December 2003, a 911 call led Coral Springs police to a quiet apartment complex in South Florida. What they found inside apartment 6 would unravel a story of obsession, betrayal, and a deadly spiral that no one saw coming. Martha PINEDA was a 44-year-old office manager and mother of 2. Intelligent, composed, and respected by her peers, she had no prior criminal record, but behind closed doors, her relationship with 27-year-old Ilya Nudmanov was strained. They had lived together for nearly a year. She was nearly twice his age. He wanted out, and she knew it. Prosecutors would later describe her as controlling and possessive. Friends said she kept close tabs on Ilya, even screening his phone calls. Ilya had reportedly told people he planned to leave her, that he was moving on. And Martha, it seemed, couldn't let him go. On December 10th, investigators believe PINEDA gave Ilya a high dose of Xanax, a drug they both occasionally used recreationally. But this time, something changed. According to testimony from her own family members, once Ilya became unconscious, she calmly placed her hands over his mouth and nose and ended his life. The next few days were filled with deliberate moves. PINEDA didn't run. Instead, she called her 2 brothers and her eldest son to her apartment. Over coffee and cigarettes, she told them what had happened and asked for help hiding the body. They refused to participate, but at her request went to Home Depot and purchased a large plastic container. When police finally entered the apartment 4 days later, tipped off by an anonymous call, they found Ilya's body in that same container. The room smelled of incense. The container was sealed and partially hidden. The truth, however, had already begun to emerge. At trial, the prosecution portrayed PINEDA as cold and calculating. She'd filled a prescription for 90 Xanax pills just 2 days before Ilya's death. She went to work the next morning, told friends and family he was sick in rehab or had run off with another woman. Every version of the truth except the real one. Her defense attorney argued she was impaired by prescription drugs, unable to fully comprehend her actions, and insisted that Ilya could have overdosed. But the jury wasn't convinced. In March 2007, Martha Pineda was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Her sons wept in court. So did Ilya's mother. Between them sat a woman who had lost everything and taken a life in the process. A former psychiatrist's assistant, a community member, and a mother now a convicted murderer. In the end, this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a slow-burning fuse of jealousy, fear, and control, until the moment it all collapsed. And as the doors of a courtroom closed behind Martha Pineda, so did the last chapter of a story that began not with violence, but with love. 41. Jacquiline Nikki Reynolds. In May 1997, a 911 operator in Coral Springs, Florida, answered a call that would unravel one of the city's most haunting family tragedies. On the line was 17-year-old Jacquiline Nicole Reynolds, known to most as Nikki. Her voice was calm. Her words were chilling. "I stabbed my mom." Just hours earlier, Nikki had been a high school student with concerned parents and a fractured relationship with her boyfriend. By the end of that day, her adoptive mother, Billie Jean Reynolds, was gone, and Nikki's life was forever changed. Nikki was adopted as an infant into a deeply religious household. Her parents, Robert and Billie Jean Reynolds, were active members of their local church, and by all accounts, devoted to raising their daughter. But as Nikki entered her teenage years, something shifted. Her behavior became erratic, her grades dropped, and the once trusting relationship with her parents grew tense. By the spring of 1997, Nikki had become entangled in a volatile on-again, off-again romance with a boy named Carlos Infante. When the relationship ended, she spiraled. She told friends she was pregnant, she wasn't. She faked a rape allegation, which unraveled under investigation. Her parents urged her to seek psychiatric help. She refused. On the evening of May 14th, Nikki returned home from church counseling. Her father left for choir practice. Alone in the house with her mother, Nikki picked up a kitchen knife. In a later confession, she said she had planned to harm not only her mother, but her father and ex-boyfriend as well. But after a struggle with Billie Jean, Nikki stopped. She called 911 and then calmly waited for police. Officers arrived to find Billie Jean Reynolds deceased in the family home. Nikki was arrested on the spot and charged with first-degree murder. The case would grip the community not just because of the crime itself, but because of who committed it, a teen raised in a loving home, now claiming she'd lost control of her mind. At trial, Nikki's defense argued insanity, citing her history of emotional instability and a possible genetic predisposition to mental illness. A defense psychiatrist described her as suffering from major depression and borderline personality disorder. But the jury didn't accept it. In 1999, she was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 34 years in prison. That sentence was later reduced to just under 22 years after a review of Florida's sentencing guidelines. With credit for time served and good behavior, she became eligible for release in 2019. Nikki Reynolds' story remains one of complexity, marked by mental health struggles, a family's heartbreak, and the irrevocable damage of a single decision. In court, her final words to her family were simple. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't mean to tear the family apart." But in the end, the damage was done. 42. Yudenia RODRIGUEZ. In the quiet outskirts of Miami-Dade County, in a modest mobile home nestled within a tight-knit community, a family that had already endured more than most was shattered by a single irreversible act. On October 6, 2013, 40-year-old Yudenia RODRIGUEZ, the daughter of Cuban immigrant Sonia Santiesteban, was arrested for the unthinkable, charged with murdering the very woman who raised her. Sonia Santiesteban had lived a hard life. After arriving from Cuba during the Mariel boat lift in 1980, she worked for decades cleaning homes, scrubbing hotel rooms, doing whatever it took to build a future for her family. When her son fell into the grip of drugs and prison, and the children's mother lost custody, Sonia did what few others would. At age 57, she adopted her 3 grandchildren to keep them out of foster care. It was, she later said, the best decision she ever made. But Sonia's strength had its limits. A fall in 2011 left her reliant on a wheelchair. And in 2013, she made another difficult decision, asking her adult daughter Yudenia, who was no longer living with the family, but had recently moved back in, to leave her home once again. What followed was a sudden explosion of rage. According to police, a verbal fight quickly escalated. Sonia, physically vulnerable, was pushed to the ground. Yudenia struck her, then allegedly seized a kitchen knife. Her 15-year-old niece, one of the grandchildren Sonia had raised as her own, witnessed the confrontation and tried to call for help. But Yudenia stopped her. The girl ran from the house screaming. Within hours, Yudenia RODRIGUEZ was taken into custody. She was charged with second-degree murder, child abuse, and tampering with a witness. Her behavior at the bond hearing the next day was unsettling. When told she was being charged with her mother's murder, she calmly replied, "She didn't die." She corrected the judge, interrupted her attorney, and then mid-hearing appeared to fall asleep. The judge ordered an immediate psychological evaluation. Yudenia declined to speak with investigators, invoking her right to remain silent. But her past was already under scrutiny. Family members and neighbors described her as troubled. Sonia herself had hinted at Yudenia's mental health struggles in the past, though it remains unclear why she was allowed back into the home. The judge ultimately held her without bond. Meanwhile, the 3 children Sonia had fought so hard to protect were once again left without a home. In an emergency hearing, custody was temporarily granted to the family's church pastor, a man who had known them for years and vowed to keep them together. "They're like family to me," he said, "and we can take them in." As of today, Yudenia RODRIGUEZ remains in custody in Miami-Dade County Jail, awaiting further proceedings. Her story, and her mother's, remain a haunting reminder of how fragile even the strongest families can become when history, hardship, and untreated wounds collide. There were no strangers in that home, no outside threats. Only a mother trying to preserve peace and a daughter unable to find her own. 43. Julie Powers, SCHENECKER. In the quiet suburbs of Tampa, Florida, the SCHENECKER family seemed to represent the ideal American life. 2 bright, accomplished teenagers, a decorated U.S. Army colonel, and a stay-at-home mother devoted to her family. But behind the carefully kept lawns and picture-perfect appearances, a storm had been building, and on January 28, 2011, it broke in the most tragic way imaginable. Julie Powers SCHENECKER, once a military linguist fluent in Russian, had long battled mental illness. Her struggles, depression, bipolar disorder, and substance dependency, had remained mostly invisible to the outside world. But inside the home, tensions were rising. Julie's relationship with her children, Calix and Beau, had grown strained. There were reports of emotional outbursts, and months before the tragedy, a child abuse complaint filed by her daughter. On that January morning, a concerned call from Julie's mother in Texas brought police to the family's upscale home in the Tampa Palms neighborhood. Officers entered to find an unsettling scene. Julie was on the back patio, disoriented and covered in blood. Inside, they found 13-year-old Beau in the family's SUV and 16-year-old Calix upstairs in her bedroom. Both had lost their lives. Julie was arrested at the scene and, according to investigators, offered a chilling confession. She claimed her children had been mouthy, disrespectful. In a note later recovered from the home she had written of her plan, one that involved buying a firearm, taking the lives of her children, and then her own. The gun had been purchased 5 days earlier. The killings, she wrote, had only been delayed by the mandatory waiting period. Within hours, the illusion of a happy suburban household was shattered. Julie was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At her arraignment, she pleaded not guilty. Her legal team indicated they would pursue an insanity defense. Prosecutors, meanwhile, announced they would seek the death penalty. As the criminal case unfolded, so did a civil one. Parker SCHENECKER, Julie's husband and the children's father, had been deployed overseas at the time of the incident. After filing for divorce, he brought a wrongful death lawsuit against his wife following a dispute over legal defense funds. Julie's attorneys responded by pointing to Parker's alleged awareness of her mental state. In personal emails, he'd described her as unstable, once saying she had the judgment of a 10-year-old. Yet the legal arguments did little to explain the emotional devastation. Friends and neighbors recalled Calix as a gifted artist passionate about social causes, and Beau as charismatic and kind, with a love for soccer and an infectious smile. At their memorial, Parker SCHENECKER vowed to spend the rest of his life honoring them. Julie SCHENECKER remains in custody in Hillsborough County, awaiting further legal proceedings. The courtroom battles may continue, but the central question persists: how does a mother once loving, once trusted, come to turn on her own children? Perhaps we'll never fully understand. But this case stands as a sobering reminder: appearances can deceive, and even in the quietest neighborhoods, the deepest fractures can hide in plain sight. 44. Courtney Christine SCHULHOFF. In 2004, a quiet apartment in Altamonte Springs, Florida, became the center of one of the most shocking juvenile homicide cases the state had ever seen. At the heart of it all was a 16-year-old girl, her 20-year-old boyfriend, and a crime that raised unsettling questions about influence, motive, and truth. Courtney Christine SCHULHOFF had grown up between 2 parents following a divorce, eventually living full-time with her father, Stephen SCHULHOFF. By the time she was a teenager, Courtney had dropped out of high school and was working on a GED. Around that time, she met Michael Morin, a 20-year-old on probation for car theft. Despite the age gap and his criminal record, the two started dating. Stephen didn't approve. He tried to intervene, but Courtney and Michael continued their relationship in secret. Tensions at home escalated. Courtney would later claim her father was physically abusive and controlling allegations that were never substantiated. Still, the conflict between father and daughter was real and growing. On the morning of February 10, 2004, Stephen SCHULHOFF was found dead inside his apartment. He had been beaten with a baseball bat, his body hidden inside a storage container. That same day, Courtney and Michael were spotted fleeing the scene in Stephen's vehicle. They were later apprehended after a brief foot chase near a shopping center. Both were charged with first-degree murder. Initially, Courtney blamed Michael. She told investigators he had acted alone using a baseball bat she had left outside her father's bedroom. But Michael claimed Courtney had orchestrated everything, that she'd pushed for the murder, supplied the weapon, and tried to hide the evidence afterward. Courtney's trial began in September 2006. She didn't testify in her own defense. Her legal team didn't call a single witness. Prosecutors painted a picture of manipulation and motive, a rebellious teen angry over lost privileges and forbidden love. The jury agreed. Courtney was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Then came the twist. Moments before her sentencing, Courtney stood in open court and stunned the room. "Your Honor," she said, "Michael Morin is not the person who killed my father. I was." She accepted full responsibility too late to change her own fate, but just in time to cast doubt on Morin's upcoming trial. A few months later, Michael Morin went before a jury. This time Courtney testified in his defense, repeating her claim that she alone committed the crime. But the jury didn't believe her. Michael was also convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Today, Courtney SCHULHOFF remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida. Michael Morin is serving his sentence at Taylor Correctional. Both are ineligible for parole. This case, defined by conflicting statements, a courtroom confession, and irreversible choices, still leaves more questions than answers. Was Courtney trying to protect Michael after her own fate was sealed? Or was she telling the truth too late when no one was willing to listen? In the end, one life was taken, two were destroyed, and the truth remains buried somewhere between a broken home and a bat left outside a bedroom door. 45. Misty Stoddard. She was just 11 years old, autistic, bright-eyed, and eager to learn. But 5 months after arriving at her father's home in Sarasota County, Florida, Melissa Stoddard was gone. At the center of the tragedy was Misty Stoddard, her stepmother. Born in 1977, Misty seemed at a glance like a typical mother of 5. But prosecutors would later describe her as controlling volatile and overwhelmed traits that collided fatally with the demands of caring for a special needs child. Melissa came to live with Misty and her biological father, Kenneth, in the summer of 2012. Her mother, facing allegations involving Melissa's older brother, sent her to Florida for safety. But instead of refuge, the girl entered a deeply dysfunctional home, isolated under pressure, and with no one truly on her side. Melissa's teachers in North Carolina described her as spirited, funny, and affectionate. She loved to swim and recite movie lines, but in Sarasota, she was rarely seen outside. A neighbor recalled the sounds of yelling and a child crying more than 20 times over a few weeks, but no one intervened. The abuse, according to testimony, escalated over time. A makeshift board was discovered drilled with holes for restraints. It became part of what prosecutors called a homemade torture device. Melissa was reportedly bound to this board, her mouth taped shut. The stated intent was to restrain her during tantrums. The result was silence, permanent silence. On December 12, 2012, Melissa was found unresponsive. She had been tied down and gagged. Her brain was starved of oxygen. She died 5 days later. An investigation quickly turned toward Misty and Kenneth Stoddard. Misty was arrested within days and charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. In court, prosecutors presented physical evidence, chilling video clips, and testimony from Misty's own teenage son, who said he had seen Melissa tied down at night. A cellmate testified that Misty admitted to gagging the girl the night she stopped breathing. Throughout the trial, Misty's defense tried to shift blame to Kenneth. She claimed the board was his idea, intended originally for adult fantasies, and that he orchestrated the abuse. But the jury didn't buy it. In June 2014, Misty Stoddard was found guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. She received the mandatory sentence, life in prison without parole plus 30 additional years. As she stood before the judge, Misty addressed the court, "I loved Melissa. I take full responsibility for the actions and inactions that led to this event. If I could change it, I would." But Melissa's mother, Leisha, left no room for forgiveness. In a letter read aloud, she wrote, "You are a poor excuse for a mother and a human being. I will never forgive you." Today, Misty Stoddard remains behind bars, and Kenneth Stoddard faced his own charges shortly after. Melissa's death sparked questions about accountability, how schools, neighbors, and agencies failed to act in time. One advocate put it this way: she didn't scream. She couldn't. A haunting reminder that some of the most vulnerable among us live quietly and suffer quietly until it's too late. 46. Angela STOLDT. In a quiet Florida suburb just outside Deltona, something unimaginable unfolded behind the walls of a modest home on Horseshoe Terrace. It began with a financial disagreement, ordinary, almost mundane. But it ended in a crime so bizarre, it left even seasoned investigators speechless. Angela STOLDT, a 42-year-old mother of two, was hardly the type most would suspect of harboring dark intentions. She worked part-time, cared for her children, and lived across the street from James Schieffer, a 36-year-old limo driver. The two shared more than proximity, they also shared a bank account. Angela had agreed to manage James's disability payments as his designated payee. But money was tight, tensions rose, and by early April 2013, things spiraled out of control. According to prosecutors, it started on the afternoon of April 3rd. Angela picked James up from work. The two returned to her house, shared drinks, vodka, and peach schnapps, and began to argue about finances. Angela claimed James owed her hundreds of dollars and had been pressuring her to secure a loan from her terminally ill father. But what happened next wasn't just about debt, it was about desperation. Angela laced James's drink with prescription muscle relaxants. Once drowsy, she drove him to a nearby cemetery, a secluded place she claimed was chosen to avoid upsetting her children. There, under the shadow of old oaks, she stabbed him with an ice pick and strangled him with a cord. Angela later insisted it was self-defense, that James had threatened her, that she feared for her life and her children's safety. But the evidence would tell a different story. Instead of calling authorities, Angela took James's body back to her home. She wrapped his head in plastic to contain the blood, and then over the next 48 hours began dismembering his body in her garage. She used a hacksaw and household tools. When disposing of the body became too difficult, she attempted to destroy the remains herself, placing parts in the oven, boiling others on the stove. When her daughter asked about the strange smell, Angela told her it was just a dead animal. Her son was also drawn into the aftermath, unknowingly helping dispose of trash bags, believing they were removing a deer his mother had hit with her car. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks later that Angela confessed, not to police but to her family. Distraught, sleep-deprived, and reportedly suicidal, she broke down at her parents' home. Her sister made the call that finally brought the truth to light. Angela was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a human corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. In court, she showed little emotion. A jury took just under 3 hours to convict her. On December 5, 2014, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Angela STOLDT remains incarcerated in Florida. She has maintained that her actions were driven by fear. But prosecutors, jurors, and investigators saw something else, a chilling level of calculation and a deeply disturbing attempt to erase a life. In a police interview, she said without hesitation, "Thursday is when I was cooking him. Friday is when I was dumping him." It's a case that still lingers in the memory of Volusia County, not just because of what happened, but because it happened so quietly, so close to home. 47. Bobbie Sue TERRELL. In the dim hours of night, when most of the world sleeps, the halls of a St. Petersburg nursing home became a silent stage for something sinister. Between November 13th and November 26, 1984, 12 elderly patients died under suspiciously similar circumstances on the midnight shift, under the watch of one woman, Bobbie Sue TERRELL. Born Bobbie Sue Dudley in 1952, she came from the small town of Woodlawn, Illinois. Her early life was marked by instability, illness, and tragedy. With several siblings suffering from muscular dystrophy, she seemed drawn to caretaking from a young age. She trained as a nurse in the 1970s, but her path was far from ordinary. By her late 20s, Bobbie Sue had already been hospitalized multiple times for physical conditions and for severe psychological disorders. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and later exhibiting signs of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, she developed a disturbing pattern, feigning illness, harming herself, and placing herself at the center of crises. Her marriage ended after allegations she drugged her adopted son. Her nursing license in Illinois was suspended following self-inflicted injuries on the job. Yet somehow, by 1984, Bobbie Sue had secured a fresh start in Florida. Under the name Dudley, she became the night shift supervisor at North Horizon Health Center in St. Petersburg. It didn't take long for the deaths to begin. The first was Aggie Marsh, age 97. Days later, Anna Larson, who wasn't even diabetic, nearly died of an insulin overdose. On Bobbie Sue's shift, insulin normally locked away appeared to move freely. Records were altered. Patterns began to emerge. More patients, elderly, vulnerable, many nearing the end of life, suddenly passed without clear cause. By November 25th, 4 more patients had died. And on what staff later called the Holocaust Monday, 5 others followed. Some saw coincidence. Others suspected something much darker. That night, Bobbie Sue was found with a stab wound. She claimed a prowler had attacked her. But the wound investigators would later determine was self-inflicted. Under her mattress, authorities discovered a handwritten list of the deceased, marked by bed number and time of death. It was as if she were keeping score. An investigation revealed that Bobbie Sue had been the only one with access to the insulin cabinet. An anonymous phone call, later suspected to be her own, warned of murders at the facility. Eventually, forensic testing, exhumations, and psychiatric evaluations all pointed in one direction. On March 17, 1986, Bobbie Sue TERRELL was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Anna Larson. Additional charges followed for the insulin-related deaths of 4 others. In court, prosecutors painted the picture of a woman whose need for control, attention, and proximity to suffering had gone unchecked for too long. Faced with overwhelming evidence and psychiatric testimony, Bobbie Sue pleaded guilty in 1988 to 4 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 65 years in prison. She would never leave. Bobbie Sue TERRELL died behind bars on August 27, 2007, at the age of 54. To this day, the full number of her victims remains uncertain. Some say it may have been as few as 2. Others believe it was far more. What is certain is that her case forced regulators to rethink how nurses are licensed and how red flags in patient care are investigated. One psychiatrist called her an extremely interesting and quite bizarre patient. But for the families of those who died, the tragedy was neither interesting nor bizarre. It was heartbreaking. Sometimes the people we trust to care for us are the ones we need protection from most. 48. Tonya THOMAS. It was just after 3 a.m. on May 15, 2012, when a quiet neighborhood in Port St. John, Florida, was shaken awake by a series of gunshots. In the early morning silence, 4 children, bleeding, terrified, ran to a neighbor's door pleading for help. Moments later, they were gone, called back into the house by their mother. Tonya THOMAS, 33 years old, was a single mother of 4. Joel, Jacquiline, Jaxes, and Pebbles Johnson, ages 12 to 17, were the center of her world. But beneath the surface, something was unraveling. Tonya had endured years of domestic violence, a volatile relationship with her children's father, and mounting stress as the sole caregiver. Though records show no clear signs of abuse toward her children, authorities had responded to multiple calls involving family conflict in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Despite prior domestic disturbances, including one just weeks before when Tonya reported her son had physically attacked her child, welfare investigators had recently closed the case. The children told officials they felt safe. Everything on paper looked stable. But something changed that morning. Before the sun rose, Tonya sent a chilling text message to a friend. "Tell my mother what happened. I want to be cremated with my children." That message was never read in time. Armed with a .38 caliber revolver, Tonya shot each of her children inside their home. 3 of them managed to flee to a neighbor's doorstep. What happened next remains one of the most haunting aspects of this case. When Tonya emerged from the house, she appeared calm. She called to her children, simply saying, "Come home." And they did. Shortly after, more gunshots rang out. By the time deputies arrived, they found 17-year-old Pebbles collapsed outside. She was rushed to an ambulance but did not survive. Inside the house, officers discovered the bodies of the other 3 children and Tonya Thomas dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In total, she had fired 19 rounds, 18 at her children, 1 at herself. Investigators never recovered a suicide note. There was no official motive. Only fragments of a life under pressure, domestic violence reports, prior arrests, and a text that spoke more in grief than in anger. Authorities later described Tonya as private, independent, and overwhelmed. She wasn't known for public outbursts or erratic behavior, but neighbors did report arguments, loud disturbances, and calls to police over the years. There were warning signs, but no one could have predicted this. The Brevard County Sheriff's Office called the case unprecedented. Not just because of the violence, but because of the victims' ages, teenagers, old enough to run, old enough to know fear. And yet, when their mother called, they returned. The tragedy left a community searching for answers. A candlelight vigil was held. Grief counselors were dispatched to the children's schools. For many, the pain went beyond the headlines. It struck at something deeper, a realization that even those closest to us can be struggling in silence. In the end, this wasn't a story about a criminal mastermind or a calculated act of violence. It was about a family that collapsed from the inside under the weight of trauma, isolation, and untreated pain. And the question that still lingers is one we may never answer: why? 49. Alexandra Victoria Tobias. It started with a click. A Facebook game, a crying infant, and a moment of irreversible rage. Alexandra Victoria Tobias was just 22 years old in January of 2010. A young mother living in Jacksonville, Florida. Tobias was recently adjusting to life with her 3-month-old son, Dylan Lee Edmondson. From the outside, she seemed like any other new parent, exhausted, overwhelmed, but trying to manage. She had aspirations of going to college, a close circle of friends, and a social media profile that painted a picture of normalcy. But beneath that surface, the reality was unraveling. Tobias had a history of emotional instability. She'd found her mother dead just 2 years prior and was reportedly struggling with postpartum depression. Her relationship with Dylan's father had been rocky and at times violent. Both had been arrested for domestic disputes, but even those who knew Alexandra said she was fiercely protective of her baby. So when news broke that she had been arrested for his murder, no one could believe it. On the morning of January 19, 2010, Alexandra was home playing the popular Facebook game Farmville. It was a digital escape, planting crops, collecting coins, building a pretend life. But when Dylan began crying during her gameplay, something inside her snapped. She later told investigators that she shook her son out of frustration, paused to smoke a cigarette to calm herself, then picked him up and shook him again. In one version of her story, she admitted he may have struck his head against the computer monitor. She didn't call 911 right away. Instead, she called Dylan's father. It wasn't until the baby stopped breathing that emergency services were contacted. By the time Dylan arrived at the hospital, his injuries were irreversible. The official cause of death was abusive head trauma. Tobias was arrested that same day and eventually charged with second-degree murder. The case gained national attention not only because of its tragic nature, but because of its eerie connection to social media addiction. Headlines focused on Farmville, a digital game becoming the backdrop to a very real crime. But this story wasn't about a video game. It was about the breaking point of a young woman who, in her own words, had lost control. During her trial, she claimed she was suffering from untreated mental illness, including postpartum depression, and had taken Xanax without a prescription the morning of Dylan's death. Psychologists described her as emotionally detached. Fellow inmates recalled how she laughed, colored with crayons, and wrote letters claiming innocence, describing herself as misunderstood. In February 2011, Alexandra TOBIAS pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The judge was clear in his reasoning. He who is the most defenseless among us was murdered by his own mother. And why? Because he was crying. Alexandra TOBIAS is currently serving her sentence at a Florida correctional facility. Her story continues to circulate online as a grim reminder of what can happen when untreated mental health, unrelenting stress, and a moment of rage collide. Dylan's short life is now part of a cautionary tale, one not about video games, but about responsibility trauma and the irreversible consequences of losing control when it matters most. 50. Karen Lynn Tobie. It was a quiet summer evening in Holly Hill, Florida, when 45-year-old John Cataneo stepped outside his home for what seemed like a routine conversation. Within moments, 4 gunshots echoed through the neighborhood. John collapsed on his front porch, fatally wounded. What looked like a random act of violence would soon unravel into something far more sinister, a murder for hire rooted not in rage or revenge but in greed. At the center of it all was Karen Lynn Tobie, John's wife. Karen was born in April of 1965 and appeared on the surface to be a typical suburban spouse and mother. But those who knew her best described a dual personality. There was the responsible Karen kind, helpful, even maternal. And then there was the reckless side fueled by substance abuse, instability, and a willingness to lie, manipulate, and ultimately destroy. Investigators quickly found inconsistencies in Karen's story following her husband's death. But it was a trusted neighbor and friend, Lynn Blake, who exposed the dark truth. She told police she had been part of the planning. According to Blake, Karen had grown tired of her marriage and feared that John might divorce her and take their 4-year-old son. But more than that, John had recently taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy, naming Karen as the sole beneficiary. It was supposed to secure their son's future. Instead, it became his death sentence. When Karen's initial plan to commit the murder herself failed after the gun she bought jammed, she turned to someone closer than anyone suspected, one of John's own employees, Tisjohan Cooper. For just $4,000, Cooper agreed to pull the trigger. On June 30, 2004, Karen orchestrated the moment. She sent John to the front door where Cooper was waiting. The crime was swift, cold, calculated, and carried out just steps from their child. What Karen didn't plan for was how quickly the conspiracy would fall apart. Police tracked phone calls, traced movements, and secured cooperation from Blake, who wore a wire during a conversation with Karen. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen, Blake, and Cooper were arrested that October. The courtroom drama that followed revealed a woman who showed little emotion, even when confronted with the enormity of what she'd done. Her defense painted a picture of a troubled woman, depressed, addicted, and desperate. But prosecutors saw it differently. This wasn't about impulse, the state argued. This was a methodical execution for money. On January 26, 2007, Karen Tobie was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Though eligible for the death penalty, the jury chose life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge agreed. She planned it. She paid for it. And she benefited from it until justice caught up, he said during sentencing. Her co-conspirators faced their own fates. Cooper was also convicted and sentenced to life. Blake, who had turned state's witness, pled guilty to second-degree murder. Today, Karen TOBIE remains in a Florida prison. Her son, now grown, was raised by his father's surviving family, protected from the woman who orchestrated his father's death. The case of Karen TOBIE is a haunting reminder that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes the greatest danger is found behind the door you trust the most. 51. Rachel Wade. In April 2009, the quiet suburbs of Pinellas County, Florida, became the setting for a tragedy fueled by jealousy, teenage obsession, and a love triangle that spiraled out of control. At the center was Rachel Wade, a 19-year-old waitress who had moved out of her parents' home and was trying to build a life of independence. Friends described her as bright, social, and strong-willed. But underneath her confident exterior, Rachel was consumed by something far more fragile, her relationship with a boy named Joshua Camacho. Camacho was 20, charming, and by all accounts manipulative. While he dated Rachel, he was also seeing 18-year-old Sarah Ludeman. The rivalry between the two young women escalated quickly online and off. Taunting voicemails, threatening messages, confrontations in public places. What began as a teenage feud soon boiled into something neither of them could control. Rachel and Sarah's animosity built over months, much of it fueled by social media. MySpace posts, late-night texts, and public humiliations blurred the lines between anger and obsession. Each saw the other as the obstacle to a relationship they believed they deserved. On the night of April 14th, Rachel learned that Josh was with Sarah. Fueled by heartbreak and frustration, she left her apartment taking a kitchen knife with her and went to a friend's house to calm down. At the same time, Sarah heard where Rachel was and decided to confront her. Witnesses say Sarah drove to the house and stopped abruptly. What happened next would be debated in court. Rachel claimed Sarah charged at her. Prosecutors said Rachel approached Sarah's vehicle and stabbed her before she could even step out. What's clear is this: Sarah was stabbed twice, one wound piercing her heart. She called Josh as she collapsed. Minutes later, she was gone. Rachel Wade was arrested that night and charged with second-degree murder. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a young woman driven by jealousy and intent. They played voicemails where Rachel explicitly threatened Sarah's life recordings made months before the fatal encounter. Rachel's defense argued self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, pointing out that Sarah had also harassed Rachel, even showing up at her workplace to taunt her. They claimed Rachel acted out of fear, not premeditation, but the jury wasn't convinced. After just 2.5 hours of deliberation, Rachel Wade was found guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The judge acknowledged her age and lack of a criminal record, but called her actions deliberate, not accidental. Rachel remains incarcerated at the Lowell Correctional Institution Annex. She continues to appeal her conviction, maintaining that she never meant to kill. In a later interview, Rachel reflected on how social media had fueled the conflict, saying, "You can say anything online with no consequences, but it follows you in real life." The Rachel Wade case is more than just a teenage tragedy. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly digital drama can escalate into real-world violence, and how no one wins when pride, jealousy, and revenge replace empathy. One impulsive night ended 2 young lives, one lost forever, the other locked away with regret. 52. Leslie Ann Wallace. On a quiet Sunday morning in North Fort Myers, Florida, a tragedy unfolded that would leave a family shattered and a community in disbelief. Leslie Ann Wallace was a 39-year-old Marine Corps veteran and mother of 3. To the outside world, she had faced hardship, but persevered, raising her sons and holding on to faith and family. But behind closed doors, Leslie battled demons few could see. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder and suffering from a history of mental health struggles. She had been in and out of psychiatric care and was taking medication for her condition. On September 2, 2001, those inner struggles erupted into an unthinkable act of violence. Leslie began her morning with her 6-year-old son James, known affectionately as Buggy. He was watching cartoons full of life and energy, blissfully unaware that this would be his final moment. In what prosecutors would later call a premeditated act, Leslie took a 16-gauge shotgun and fired a fatal shot. But she wasn't finished. She then drove to a church just miles away, where her 16-year-old son Kenny was attending service. As he walked outside, she pulled the trigger again, but the blast struck the Bible he held in his chest, miraculously saving his life. Panic swept through the church. Leslie fled the scene and headed to a Pizza Hut where her eldest son, 19-year-old Gregory, was working. There she tried to coax him outside, but police had warned him. He refused to come out. Leslie then called 911 from a payphone and calmly confessed, saying, "I just shot a 6-year-old boy. I'm his mother." When deputies caught up with her on the Caloosahatchee Bridge, she fired once more, this time at them. They returned fire, hitting her 6 times and ending the rampage. Leslie survived her wounds and was charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple counts of aggravated assault. Her mental state became a central issue. She had practiced Wicca, journaled about depression, and even once survived a suicide attempt. Though her defense team initially considered an insanity plea, conflicting psychiatric evaluations made that path uncertain, especially with the death penalty on the table. In 2003, Leslie pleaded no contest to all charges in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her decision, her attorney said, was made to spare her surviving sons and estranged husband the trauma of a public trial. Today, Leslie Wallace remains behind bars in Florida. Her name is etched into true crime history, not for the number of victims, but for the unbearable truth that her own children were the target. Her youngest son, James, is remembered with warmth and pain by those who knew him. His father, Bill Wallace, has spoken openly about the weight of grief, the what-ifs that never go away, and the aching final memory of waving goodbye to a boy who wanted to come along for a simple errand. "She needs to live with this the rest of her life," he said. "Just like we do." This case leaves no easy answers, only heartbreak. It reminds us that behind mental illness, untreated pain, and domestic silence, devastating consequences can take root. And when they do, they don't just break families, they rewrite them forever. 53. Melissa Christine Webb. In August 2011, a missing person case in Lee County, Florida, began unraveling into something far darker than anyone expected. What started as a simple disappearance soon exposed a trail of deception, addiction, and irreversible tragedy. Melissa Christine Webb was 28 years old at the time, born in 1982, raised in Florida, and no stranger to struggle. Her life, according to those who knew her, had been marked by instability, toxic relationships, emotional trauma, and a growing dependency on prescription painkillers. But no one imagined that her spiral would end with the death of someone she once claimed to love. Brian Sorrentino was a Navy veteran, a father of 2 young daughters, and Melissa's former boyfriend. On August 19, 2011, Brian vanished. Friends and family were immediately concerned that this wasn't like him. For weeks, there was no trace, no calls, no movement, just silence. Then a discovery in Charlotte County changed everything. Buried under a pile of debris in a remote wooded area off State Road 31, authorities found a red sleeping bag. Inside was the body of Brian Sorrentino. He had been shot and left there discarded and alone. Suspicion quickly turned to Melissa Webb. Investigators learned that in the days after Brian disappeared, Melissa had told conflicting stories about his whereabouts. She said he'd gone to Jacksonville, then to Orlando. She told people he had sold her his car and wouldn't be back. But as the lies stacked up, so did the witnesses. One man told detectives Melissa had picked him up and brought him to the home she shared with Brian. There, she calmly revealed that his body was lying just beyond the entryway, wrapped in a sleeping bag. She asked for help moving it to her trunk. Later, she tried to hand off the murder weapon to him, a small-caliber pistol. He refused. Another witness recalled Melissa asking for help disposing of Brian's car, claiming he'd given it to her. But when she stepped out of the vehicle, she never came back. By late September, Melissa Webb was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She initially denied involvement, but eventually the truth emerged. At trial, Melissa's defense claimed she had acted in fear, citing allegations of past abuse. But the jury saw through it. There was no evidence to support that narrative, and Melissa's actions in the days following the crime, her attempts to hide the body, fabricate stories, and solicit help in covering it up, told a different story. The verdict came quickly. In just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury found her guilty. On December 16, 2013, Melissa Webb was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The sentence was mandatory due to her prior felony convictions. In court, she offered a tearful apology. "I lost total control of any rational thinking that night," she said. "I want all of you to know I'm sorry, but Brian Sorrentino's family especially." His mother was unmoved. "If emotions bleed," she said, "I don't have 1 ounce of blood left." Today, Melissa Webb sits in a Florida prison, her life forever shaped by one fatal decision. Her story is a reminder that regret often comes too late, and that behind every crime there's a ripple of loss that never stops spreading. 54. Patty Michelle White. In December of 2011, the quiet calm of a Jacksonville, Florida neighborhood was shattered by a crime that stunned even seasoned investigators, not just for what happened, but for how it was hidden. Patty Michelle White, 39 at the time, was no stranger to hardship. Struggling to hold down jobs and battling instability, she had often relied on the kindness of others, including that of Michelle O'Dowd, a 67-year-old woman known by friends and family as Mickey O. Described as sweet, generous, and deeply trusting. Michelle had opened her home to Patty, offering her a place to stay when she had nowhere else to go. But that act of generosity would cost Michelle her life. On December 2, 2011, Michelle failed to show up for work. Concerned, her twin brother Phil Axt went to check on her. When he arrived at her condo, he found the front door ajar and the home ransacked, furniture, overturned decorations scattered, and an eerie silence filling the space. At first, he saw nothing, but on a third pass through the room, he noticed something unusual. Beneath a pile of Christmas gifts, packages meant for her grandchildren and nieces, was Michelle's body. It was a sight that would haunt her family forever. Police quickly learned that Patty White had recently returned to Florida from South Carolina, where she'd been living. Evidence mounted fast. Michelle's debit card had been used at nearby ATMs shortly after the murder. Surveillance cameras captured images of a woman attempting to disguise herself. Someone family members quickly identified as Patty. Authorities tracked her to York, South Carolina. 2 days after the murder, she was pulled over while riding in a car with her mother. When questioned by detectives, Patty confessed. She admitted she'd returned to rob Michelle, believing she could get away with it. But when things didn't go as planned, the situation turned deadly. Investigators believe she attempted to stage the scene, scattering holiday decorations and placing Michelle's body under Christmas presents in a twisted attempt to delay discovery. She took the victim's debit cards, withdrew cash, and fled the state. But the trail she left behind was clear and undeniable. In October 2013, nearly 2 years after the murder, Patty Michelle White pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 45 years in prison. In court, no elaborate defense was offered, no appeal for sympathy, just a quiet admission of guilt. For Michelle's family, the sentence brought some closure, but no true peace. Her twin brother described her as someone who saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. She treated Patty like family, he said. She trusted her, and she paid for that with her life. Today, Patty White remains in a Florida prison serving out her sentence. Her crime is a haunting reminder that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes wrapped in trust, just like a gift under the tree, hiding something far more sinister inside. And in this case, the price of that trust was one life lost, and many others forever changed. 55. Aileen Carol WUORNOS. It was the winter of 1989 when the body of a man was found in the woods of Volusia County, Florida. He had been shot multiple times. His name was Richard Mallory. What seemed at first like a tragic one-off killing soon spiraled into a disturbing pattern. Over the course of the next year, 6 more men would turn up dead, scattered along highways, dumped in remote areas, all victims of a mysterious, calculated hand. At the center of it all was a woman named Aileen WUORNOS. Born Aileen Carol Pittman on a leap day, February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. WUORNOS had a life few would envy. Abandoned by her mother, never knowing her father, who later died in prison for sex crimes, Aileen grew up in an abusive household and found herself homeless by age 15. She survived by hitchhiking, stealing, and eventually prostitution. Her life, marked by neglect and trauma, was a slow descent into a kind of loneliness most cannot imagine. And when that descent turned violent, the world took notice. From December 1989 to late 1990, Aileen WUORNOS murdered 7 men across Central Florida. Her victims included a store owner, a rodeo worker, a construction laborer, even a former police chief. WUORNOS claimed that each of these men had assaulted or attempted to assault her while she was working as a sex worker, and that she had acted in self-defense. But investigators and prosecutors painted a different picture, one of calculated robbery and cold-blooded murder. Her weapon of choice was a .22 caliber pistol. Her victims were all found shot, some multiple times, their cars missing, their belongings pawned. In one case, the victim's car was abandoned and spotted by witnesses who described 2 women at the scene. A palm print inside the vehicle would lead authorities straight to Aileen. She was arrested on January 9, 1991, at a bar called The Last Resort. Soon after, her partner at the time, Tyria Moore, agreed to help police gather a confession. In a series of recorded phone calls, Moore pleaded with WUORNOS to speak the truth. Within days, WUORNOS confessed to the killings. But justice in this case came with complexities. The first victim, Richard Mallory, was later revealed to have had a criminal record involving sexual assault. WUORNOS would go to trial for his murder first, and it was the only case where a jury weighed her claims of self-defense. She was convicted and sentenced to death. For the remaining murders, WUORNOS entered no contest pleas. She received 6 death sentences in total. What set WUORNOS apart from most serial killers wasn't just her gender, it was her fury. In interviews, she spoke of a deep, consuming hatred for humanity. In one chilling moment, she said, "I robbed them, and I killed them as cold as ice. And I'd do it again. I know I would kill another person because I've hated humans for a long time." After over a decade on death row, Aileen WUORNOS was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her final words were as eerie as her life, "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, big mothership and all." Her story inspired books, films, even an opera perhaps, because it sits uneasily at the intersection of tragedy and horror. Some saw a woman shaped by trauma acting out of fear. Others, a remorseless killer who used victimhood as a shield. Today, Aileen WUORNOS remains one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, a rare, unsettling portrait of female rage and irreversible violence, driven by a life that never offered her peace. 56. Pauline ZILE. In 1994, a tearful mother appeared on South Florida news pleading for the return of her missing daughter. Pauline ZILE claimed that 7-year-old Christina Holt had been abducted from a busy flea market restroom. The public sympathized. But behind the camera lights, a darker story was about to emerge, one that would shock a community and make legal history. Pauline ZILE, born June 13, 1970, had survived a difficult upbringing, abandoned by her mother, and raising a young family in the economic shadows of Palm Beach County. On the surface, she appeared to be a hardworking mother. But beneath the routine of working 2 jobs and raising children, cracks in her character and judgment began to show, cracks that ultimately cost her daughter her life. Christina Holt had been living with relatives in Maryland when she was sent to Florida to reunite with her biological mother, Pauline. The reunion, however, was anything but warm. Within weeks, Christina became the target of escalating abuse in the cramped 1-bedroom apartment where Pauline lived with her husband, John ZILE, and their 2 sons. On September 16, 1994, Christina died. Prosecutors said she was beaten by John, while Pauline stood by doing nothing to intervene. As Christina convulsed and stopped breathing, the couple hid her body in a closet, and days later buried her near a shopping plaza. Then came the lie, a televised plea staged, tears, a false story of kidnapping. It bought them time but not immunity. The timeline unraveled quickly. Witnesses came forward, including a neighbor who heard the attack. Discrepancies mounted. Eventually, John ZILE confessed, and Pauline, under immunity, gave investigators her account of what happened. But even her version minimizing her role couldn't shield her from the law. In April 1995, Pauline ZILE was convicted of first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated child abuse. The jury found she had a legal and moral duty to protect her daughter, and that failing to do so was as criminal as the act itself. What made this case legally groundbreaking was the concept of parental omission as a basis for first-degree murder. Pauline hadn't delivered the fatal blow, but she had allowed it facilitated the cover-up and lied to the public. The court determined that her silence and inaction were not just failures, they were crimes. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged mitigating factors: her lack of prior convictions, her challenging childhood, her apparent love for her 2 sons. But those facts were not enough to excuse her betrayal of Christina. On June 7, 1995, Pauline ZILE was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She wept not for her daughter, but in relief. She had escaped Florida's death row, where women like Aileen WUORNOS and Anna Cardona awaited execution. Today, Pauline ZILE remains incarcerated. Her case continues to be cited in legal circles as a precedent, reminding us that a parent's duty to protect is not just moral, but legal. Near a now faded memorial in Tequesta, a red notebook bears a child's final tribute. "Christina, we love you. Rest now, baby. You're at peace." And while the headlines have long since faded, the questions remain. What is the weight of silence in the face of suffering? And when a mother chooses denial over defense, is that not too a form of violence?